Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. It's really an honor to be here. Um, I'm Sarah. I'm a pollinator biologist. I work for the Xerces Society. I'll tell you a little bit more about our organization in a few minutes. And I live just north of Duluth as of the last 2 years. So it's fun to see your faces and make new connections. I will launch into this screen share. So I'll be talking about pollinators, most specifically native bees. I don't actually know a lot about honeybees, so if you're here to learn about honeybees, I'm sorry. And I'm going to run through pollinator status, so how they're doing right now, a little bit about life history, biology, and then end with how we can help. And I'll just launch right in. So the organization that I work for is focused on the protection of invertebrates and their habitats. And we're called Cerseis. We take our name from this butterfly here on the right. Can you all see my slides okay? Okay. So we take our name from the Xerces blue, which was the first butterfly to go extinct in North America. And we started as a butterfly conservation group. We've since expanded to work on really any imperiled invertebrate, ranging from pollinators to freshwater mussels, one of the most imperiled animal groups in the world. And yeah, we try to address really just what those animals need. A lot of times it's habitat, protection from pesticides, sometimes policy changes, and that sort of thing. We also do a lot of education and outreach. I'm mostly working in this region with farmers and trying to get habitat on the ground and protect it from pesticides. So this is a photo, just an example of a planting that we did on a farm in central Minnesota, native insectary strip next to broccoli. And then we do a lot of on-farm field days and other outreach events, trying to spread the word on all of this and just share knowledge, as we're all learning together how to restore these types of plant communities that have all too quickly been almost eliminated from many of our landscapes. Talking about decline a little bit, I'm sure you all have been hearing about the loss of pollinators, monarchs on the brink of extinction. What you're looking at here is just a few of many papers coming out every year, kind of quantifying these losses. And I think it's hard because with a group as obscure as insects and understudied and underappreciated, we really don't have a lot of long-term data sets to pull from to know exactly how they're doing in all parts of the country, or all the different types of species that we have. But I will say that what we do know, that what little information that we do have is alarming and is cause for concern. And I guess I'll call your attention to this paper in particular here. This was authored by a couple of my coworkers and another researcher. And I just love the title of this. It's Declines in Insect Abundance and Diversity. We know enough to act now. There are really common sense solutions to this crisis. And I think a lot of the solutions are in your community, in the way that Native people have and do view land, not as a resource to be exploited, but as networks of brothers and sisters to cherish and coexist with. And yeah, and I don't even know. It's honestly kind of hard for me to be even giving you this talk, because I need to be learning from you. And like that first species that I showed you that went extinct in North America, that butterfly, that was largely on account of human land use. I want to say land use changes, but honestly, land exploitation, and not just impacting animals that I'm talking about today, but also people's. And I don't exactly know where to go from here. But at Xerces, we're really just trying to take actions. We don't do a lot of research where we're studying these problems to death. We're a little bit opposed to insect collection, which limits the ability to do research. But trying to build partnerships and yeah, move forward as we can. Here is a graph. A lot of these first slides are pretty depressing, but this is showing you the eastern monarch population decline and what we have seen through time since we started monitoring. And monarchs are an example of a species that's very unique in that they all congregate in one place over the winter down in Mexico, which makes them fairly easy to study and evaluate their population trends. So I'll help you make sense of this here. The graph is showing the area of forest that these congregated monarchs are covering in their overwintering grounds through time. So this all-time high that we know of, I imagine in the past the population was even larger, but the all-time high that we know of was in the late 90s. And at that point, they were covering around 45 acres of ground. This all-time low that we know about was in 2013, 2014, and they were covering at that point just a couple of acres. So from 45 acres of monarchs to 2 acres of monarchs, that is a striking decline that cannot be, you can't really miss that decline. And I'm sure a lot of you, especially the elders in your community, have seen this with your own eyes, the monarchs that you used to see and now you're not seeing them. Where we're sitting at right now, this is the numbers that we got back from last year, 2020. They were covering about 5 acres of ground in Mexico. And these are the monarchs that we are breeding. So the milkweed that we plant produces these monarchs that fly down there. So we're largely responsible for the numbers in Mexico. And that 5 acres is not considered to be enough to sustain a viable population. We're falling short. This green, can you all see my cursor? I don't know. Yes. Okay. So this green bar here is where the bare minimum of where we want to be with monarch numbers. Bumblebees are also in decline. We have looked really closely at the historic data, and by historic, I mean like the past 100 years, and compared that with more recent bumblebee data and found that over a quarter of our bumblebees are at risk of extinction, and that's based on changes in abundance and changes in range. So bees that used to be all across the Northeast are in some cases just hanging on in a tiny part of the Midwest or vice versa. I'll show you a map here. I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of the rusty patch bumblebee. It was the first bumblebee, the first bee actually to be federally listed as endangered in the US. And you can see on the left, this is the former range, very widespread and also very common. It was Wisconsin's most abundant, most common bumblebee. And now it is, you can see in red, the recent detections. So gone from most of the Northeast. In these places where it is still occurring, it's very rare. And yeah, overall, it's experienced 87% loss in range, 92% decline in abundance. So what's at stake? Pollinators are critical to ecosystem health. Most of our flowering plants, 85% of our flowering plants require a pollinator, typically an insect and typically a bee to move that pollen around and produce the fruit for that next generation. The diversity of our wild plant communities, the longevity of our wild plant communities is very much dependent on healthy pollinator populations. A lot of animals, like this black bear here eating June berries, depend on pollinators for fruit and seed and nuts, just like we do in our own diets. And then pollinators themselves are important food for wildlife. The majority of songbirds must feed their fledglings insect larvae, typically butterfly and moth larvae. Later, as the birds develop and grow older, they can eat a more varied diet, but when they're young, they really do need insect larvae, and those larvae in turn are dependent on the right native plant that they need to feed on. So if we are losing these native plants from our landscapes, we're losing the whole trophic cascade all the way up the food chain. You see problems. Pollinators are also critical to our diets. 2/3 of our crop plants are insect dependent, about 35% of what we actually grow. So 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat, you all have probably heard that before. Many of our necessary vitamins and minerals come from insect pollinated fruits, nuts, vegetables, seeds. I hate to even mention the economic significance of all of this, because in my mind, that's so trivial relative to just the inherent value that these creatures have. But the economic significance is part of what's driven a lot of attention and funding coming towards this issue. There are places in the world where people have to hand pollinate with paintbrushes, and you can imagine how costly that would be. Okay, so there's a lot of different insects that visit flowers. These are just a few of the main groups. Bees get a lot of attention. Well, maybe I'll ask you all, why are bees the most important pollinators, or why do they get so much attention for their role? Maybe no one wants to unmute themselves, and that's fine too. You can see, just looking at this picture, they're very hairy, collecting a lot of pollen. They have these bodies that are really well adapted to pollen collection. And that relates to the fact that of all those other insects that visit flowers, hang out on flowers, maybe look for a mate, whatever, bees are the only ones that are actually actively carrying pollen, gathering pollen onto their body, bringing it home to feed their young. All these other insects that I showed you, they just feed themselves or hang out, but they're not gathering pollen. Okay, so bees are gathering pollen, which means they're carrying a lot of pollen around, and as they do that, they're incidentally pollinating, incidentally or intentionally. We don't exactly know, but they're excellent pollinators for that reason. They also exhibit floral constancy, which means when they learn to work a given floral resource, so they understand, say, the floral morphology of an apple blossom, they will stick with apple blossoms all day or all week until that resource is eliminated or reduced. And then they might change to a different flower. But from an apple's perspective, that's really helpful, because the apple wants pollen from another apple, not from some other species of plant. Okay, so a lot of times when people hear the word bee or think about bees, honeybees will come to mind. They're well known for the honey that they produce that feeds us. But I wanted to go through some of the differences between honeybees and native bees, just to clear up any confusion there. So honeybees, we have just one species in the upper Midwest, an introduced European species. Native bees, we have over 460 different species in this region. My slides aren't, oh, somebody's in the waiting room. Okay, hang on. Honeybees are not at risk of extinction. Beekeepers are struggling. You all are probably quite familiar with that. And the struggle of beekeepers and of honeybees has brought in a lot of attention to this issue, and a lot of the threats, like pesticides, that are common across both honeybees and native bees. But they're not at risk of extinction. So we know how to rear them. We know how to keep them going, even if it's costly to do so or inconvenient. Native bees, in contrast, many are at risk of extinction, and we have no idea how to rear them or keep their populations going when they're when we lose them. Honeybees are managed by humans. Native bees are mostly not. There are a few species that we've figured out how to rear them and transport them and use them as commercial crop pollinators. But for the most part, they are out in the wild doing their own thing. Honeybees have a nest provided for them. Native bees nest in the wild. And I bring that up because this is one more struggle that native bees are faced with. They have to find their own nest, and nests are often quite limiting in the modern landscape. Honeybees are social and have really large colonies, thousands of bees. Native bees are mostly solitary and mostly have small nests. So sometimes on the order of just, a mother with 5 offspring. And this matters. I bring this up because if you think about a honeybee out in the landscape and maybe exposed to pesticides and loses, she might lose her ability to navigate and find her way home. That's a loss, but there's a lot of redundancy in a honeybee colony. There's, like I said, thousands of workers. So it's a loss, but it doesn't mean the end of that lineage. Whereas if you have a mother solitary bee out foraging and she encounters a pesticide and either dies outright or isn't able to find her way home, that's the end. Her offspring are not going to get food and not going to be able to make, that next generation isn't going to carry over. So like I said, there's a lot of threats in common between these two groups, but native bees are disproportionately affected. Honeybees prefer non-native flowers, like a lot of our invasive weeds. So people ask me all the time, like, oh, is it bad to keep honeybees? Or, what are the issues with honeybees? It's complicated. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I will say that honeybees can cause invasive plant issues to increase, especially in natural areas where you would otherwise have pretty intact plant communities, just because those are the flowers they evolved with. Those are the flowers that they're going to prefer. And native bees, in contrast, some of them are generalists and they'll visit native and non-native plants, but a lot of them are dependent on native species. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, native bees are really diverse. We have, like I said, 460 different species in Minnesota and counting, and about 3,600 in the United States. This diagram here is kind of busy, I know, but I'm just pointing out that these are all the different species, 3,600 species. Bumblebees and honeybees, the groups that are most well known to most of us, make up just a sliver of that diversity. So we also have things like, this is one of my favorite bees, the small Carpenter bees. They pollinate raspberries and they nest in raspberry canes. So kind of like everything they need is in one little package. Carter bees, these are bees that collect the soft hairs. They use their mouth parts, collect soft hairs off of like our prairie sages and use those hairs to make their nest. We have green sweat bees, which many of you have probably seen. They're really showy and iridescent. All kinds of bees, thousands of kinds of bees. I tend to wrap my head around native bee diversity in terms of their nesting habitat. So we have ground nesting bees, we have wood nesting bees, and we have bumblebees. And I'll talk through each of these groups. So the ground nesting bees make up the majority of our bees. The nests they're hard to find. They're underground. There's typically just one entrance, and the nests are small, so there's not a lot of activity at the nests. They can be a few centimeters deep to a meter or more, and they're active for a very short period. So the mother will be provisioning, she builds the nest actually. So she digs it out. provisions it with pollen and nectar. This is a little larva developing on a ball of pollen and nectar. And then once she's done all of that work, she seals it off and leaves. So there's really no active parenting, as far as I know, in most of these species of ground nesting bees. As far as the life cycle, here's an adult in the spring. Actually, I just saw this flower in bloom recently, the spring beauty. And this bee is actually a specialist on this flower. So she's out collecting pollen from the only flower that she likes, brings that pollen home, puts it in her nest. When she has enough of it, she shapes it into this loaf of bee bread, lays her egg. There's the larva developing. This whole part of the cycle is actually most of the year. So the adult, we think of bees as, you know, these little creatures here flying around, but really most of their life is spent underground in one of these stages. And then the following spring, she will emerge and do it all over again. Here's some photos showing the nests from the outside. And like I said, it's quite uncommon to actually see this happen, but if you watch for it, you'll start to see little bees busy with soil, kind of digging around or going in and out. A lot of people think that they see ground nesting bees, but they are often actually seeing social wasps like the yellow jacket. And those are much more commonly encountered just because of the size of their nests. So they have a large nest underground with all these combs. It's an amazing resource that these workers are defending, so that they tend to be more aggressive because they have a lot at stake underground there. Whereas these solitary bees on the left, again, it's typically just one mother. She doesn't have a lot, a lot at stake in that nest, and she's typically not guarding the nest the way the social wasps are. So if you think you get stung by a bee, it might be a bee, but it's probably a wasp. Here I'm just showing that sometimes what we think of as beautiful or aesthetically pleasing or perfect in terms of the perfect lawn really isn't the perfect lawn for bees. This lawn over on the right, that is more what a bee would be looking for. There's places to access the soil. I don't imagine folks are using chemicals in this lawn, and it looks like there's maybe some flowers over here. There's leaf litter, there's different, there's heterogeneity, there's more diversity in structure. Whereas over here, I mean, this looks like might be a pesticide treated lawn. It's just solid turf grass. That would be really hard for a little native bee to get into and make a nest. Over this landscaping against the house looks like it's all hostas. Not a super useful, highly edible plant for native insects. All right, so now moving on to the next category, the stem and wood nesting bees. This is about 30% of our bees. They're the bees that use tunnels. Some people have probably seen like the bee hotels or bee boxes you can put up. These are the bees that would use that type of nesting structure. We have 13 different genera in Minnesota that use these various plant parts, stems, branches, wood, ranging from the small carpenter bees. I mentioned these earlier. This is like a little small carpenter bee on a raspberry. Osmia bees, leafcutter bees. Their life cycle is similar to the ground nesters, except that their nest construction is more of a linear series, like you can see in this image. The cells, again, there's little bedrooms made for each offspring. Each offspring gets their own ball of food. The bedrooms or cells are partitioned with a variety of different materials. In this case, you can see mud, but in some cases they will use leaves or petals. And it's not unusual for it to take a bee all day to build and provision a single cell. And that can be over 1,000 different trips to flowers. So to me, that speaks to the importance of having a lot of flowers in our landscape, and also having our flowering habitat in close proximity to our nesting habitat because, anything we can do to limit that flight time between the two can be really helpful. Uh, so the leafcutter bees are the ones that use leaves to partition their cells. And I had a lot of fun last summer in the Duluth area, just on various hikes looking for evidence of leafcutter bees, and they really are all over the place. Black ash, juneberry, dwarf raspberry, honeysuckle, roses. You can tell, so a lot of plants will, have damage from insects or signs of herbivory from caterpillars and all different kinds of insects. But you can tell when it's a leafcutter bee when it's a really clean cut and typically shaped like a circle or an oval, like you can kind of see in all of these pictures. And we're still learning about what plants these leafcutter bees prefer. So anything you see would be of interest, and definitely reach out if you're seeing cool stuff. This is one that I saw going home. This is right in front of my house, actually. And this bee was cutting from some plant. I actually wasn't able to figure out what plant she was cutting from, but she was carrying these leaf pieces home, tucked between her legs, and then pulling them down underground and coming back and doing it all over again for 2 days. And then then she finished it off and didn't see her again. But her larvae are still under my sidewalk, which is fun. So stem stubble is another great resource for native bees. And what I mean by that is just, if you've got a wildflower garden, or even raspberry bushes, rose bushes, hydrangeas, and you rather than in the spring or in the fall doing like a full-blown garden cleanup and taking all of that plant material and composting it or throwing it away, rather than doing that, we encourage you to cut all of your plants at varying heights from like 6 to 12 to maybe 24 inches, whatever you feel like you're comfortable with aesthetically. But leave that stubble around and you will see it's just amazing, actually, how easy it is to create habitat that you can actually watch and see the bees going in and out of. It's super, super entertaining and rewarding, I think. And then you don't have to do anything more. The plants will grow up as summer progresses and cover up that stubble, and that stubble will eventually naturally decompose. So it's quite easy. This was a yard I just stumbled across in Duluth where they were doing that. Here's just a few plants that are great for these stem nesters. So ranging from hyssop to sumac, raspberries, asters, goldenrods, bee balm. Almost every cut stem of bee balm that I make with, I usually just go out with the scissors or pruners. Almost everyone gets occupied. So I think that's a favorite. Branches and canes are also really valuable. I mentioned sumac and raspberry, and there are a few more as well. Sorry, these are a little bit busy slides, but if you're interested in any of these, I'm happy to, if you can just email me, and I'm happy to send over any of these lists. Oops, logs and snags are also a maybe undervalued resource. I really like this picture on the right. This is another yard in Duluth where they had found it kind of a creative way to incorporate dead wood into their landscaping with this table. But yeah, these are bees that will use the holes left over by wood boring beetles. So boring beetles leads to interesting bees. If you see an empty hole, that means that's a potential nest site for a bee. If you see it capped off with leaf tissue or resin, or flower petals, any of those materials that I talked about earlier, that means that it's been occupied. So it's kind of fun to watch. dead wood is valuable at really all stages of decay, and not just for insects, but for salamanders and mushrooms and, all snakes, all kinds of wildlife. But here is an example of a couple of logs that were supporting nests of this bee here, the green sweat bee, which that's where it nests. It's kind of unusual for a bee to nest in rotting wood, but that's its preferred nest site. Bumblebees are another group that the third group I'm going to talk about. They are relatively small in terms of diversity. They make up less than 1% of all of our bees. But their life cycle, I'll start right here. So where we are right now, in the spring, you start to see the queens coming out of hibernation. So I wish I could see a show of hands, but I'm guessing many of you are starting to see your first bumblebee queens. I'm starting to see mine. And they, in the spring, they're mostly, when I see them, they're flying low, back and forth, close to the ground, looking for a nest site. And they will check out a surprising number of potential nests before they choose the perfect one, just like us looking at houses. And when they find the right one, which is typically an abandoned rodent nest, with, soft, warm, dry, they will begin to establish their nest, lay eggs. They are able to determine the sex of their offspring by choosing whether or not to fertilize the eggs. So if they fertilize, they make females, which is what they want early in the season. Because those females are workers that serve the colony and start to take over the foraging duties and also the rearing duties in the hive. In roughly July is when I start to see the first males come out, and the males are produced by, from unfertilized eggs. The males and females from different colonies have to somehow find each other, mate, and at a certain point in the fall, when it gets cold enough, everybody dies in that whole colony except for those newly mated queens. And they store sperm in a special packet on their body, for using the following season. So this stage here, this fall, winter hibernating queen, that's a really vulnerable time for bumblebees. That's the whole next generation is hinging on the success of those new queens. This is just a closer look inside the nest. You can see bumblebees are a little different. Those other bees that I explained to you, that make the separate bedrooms with food for each offspring, bumblebees instead throw all the food in a pile and then lay all the eggs on top of it. So they kind of have to fend for themselves. And the larvae grow up. This is a beautiful pupa, and here's a queen, kind of what it looks like in the hive. Leaf litter can be a really important resource for those overwintering queens I talked about. So we launched this campaign at Xerces a few years ago called Leave the Leaves. Leaves are not litter. They're food and shelter for butterflies, bees, all of these other things. Caterpillars of this butterfly, the fritillary butterfly, overwinter and fall leaves. So please leave the leaves. These signs are all on our website. If, just more resources for people to kind of justify or explain what they're doing to their neighbors if they need it. One of the most important things, I don't think this is a surprise to you all, but one of the most important things we can all do for pollinators is just include more native plants in our landscaping. Native plants are overwhelmingly more supportive of native insects, which in turn feed birds and other wildlife. I'm just kind of checking the time. This might actually be an okay point to stop for questions. Otherwise, I can cruise through too. I'm close to being done. Are you seeing anything in the chat, Caitlin?
I don't see questions, but yeah, if people are holding on to some, now would be a great time to unmute and ask, or ask it in the chat.
Okay.
Isn't Here, let me get this closer. So you had a picture of some of the bees at your house when they were taking the leaves. And I was just kind of curious, like, are any of the other pictures you've used like things that you have captured? Like, how close do you get capturing bee activity?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I take hundreds of pictures of bees. And are you saying like in terms of like them stinging, like being careful about getting
I'm
stung?
just in the sense of like you probably recognize it more because you're so immersed in like what they're doing. I don't think I would ever like think, oh, you know, now I probably will because you showed us some of the things to look for. But yeah, just kind of curious, like, and how close are you able to get? Like, somebody had to get close to get the picture of the larvae and stuff. But
Oh yeah.
is that easy to find? Like, is it somewhat easy to find or hard
Yeah,
to?
okay. So bees are really easy to find on flowers. So photographing their foraging behavior is really quite easy. Photographing their nesting activity is more challenging because partly because the window of time is so short when they're actively provisioning a nest, and also because it's just more of an intimate encounter, I guess, like getting up in their nesting space. They tend to be a little more aggressive. But yeah, I mean, as far as noticing them, I think I'm also really into mushrooming, and I still remember the summer when I first noticed mushrooms, and it was like all of a sudden they were everywhere. And I think it's just one of those things when you start paying attention to something, or just your curiosity is growing. They are everywhere. They really are. So yeah, and it's fun because there's just so many different behaviors to watch for. I do a lot of paying attention to which bee I see on which plant, so those floral associations. And then the nesting stuff. I mean, I just started paying attention to nesting a few years ago, and it's really mind-blowing and fascinating. And even though there's so much known, there's always so much more that's unknown. So it feels like that potential for discovery is definitely there.
Okay,
Yeah,
we have
fun question.
yeah. We have a couple more questions. So Mary's wondering, what can we do to provide homes for native bees and pollinators?
Yeah, good question too. I don't do a lot of recommending the bee boxes or the stem bundles or those types of artificial nesting structures. And I actually just recently at Xerces, we recently put out.
No, you're not going that far back. Come
on. We recently put out a new document that's called Natural Nesting for Pollinators. I can share the link to it in a minute, but we really focus on things like I've been talking about, like leaving the leaves, providing a less manicured lawn that has patchy soil, not every square inch vegetated, saving the stems, so creating that stem stubble, leaving dead wood around, leaving snags, logs. What else? A water resource can be important for some pollinators that need mud. They need a way to make mud. But in we have pretty heavy soils in this region anyway, so water isn't super important. Or a lot of us live near water actually. Yeah, I'll share that resource in the chat and when I'm done.
Thank you. Okay, and so are there a top 3 or 5 perennial plants to grow? Which ones would you recommend?
Yeah.
On that same line, Sue's wondering about dandelions. Are bees attracted to dandelions? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so dandelions, I'll start with dandelions. They're a non-native flower, but they are they are a pollen nectar source. They are visited by a lot of different insects, especially honeybees. They're not, I guess I'll say it, they're not great, but they're better than nothing, you know? So if I had them, I do have them in my lawn and I don't mow them because actually I eat a lot of dandelions, but yeah, I think that if you if you have the opportunity to convert a dandelion lawn to something that's more diverse and native, go for it. If you don't have that opportunity, then let it flower with whatever weedy flowers are there. So things like creeping Charlie or dandelion or, you know, violets. Violets are a sweet little native that grows in lawns. So yeah. As far as top natives, for if you were talking like in a flower garden setting, some of my favorites are bee balm, so Monarda fistulosa, native across the whole state. It's one of the most attractive plants to bumblebees. It's the only plant I've ever seen the rusty patch bumblebee on. It is edible to us. It has a taste like oregano. It's in the mint family. It's really easy to grow. It's in the mint family, so it will spread. Flowers really prolifically, really showy flower, purple. All in that same family, another one that I like, actually two more that I like to grow. I'm gonna progress my slides because I think I have. Oh, yeah, I'll skip through these. Basically, what I'm talking about here is just that there are a large number of bees that can only feed on certain plants. So picky eater bees, and some of these plant families tend to host more specialists than others. Like willow is an amazing plant for specialists. The asters and the bean and pea family. But I wanted to get to this slide here. So these are some that I just like to have around for my own use, in addition to pollinator use. So bee balm, this is the one I was just telling you about. Mountain mint, you know, I think it's the most delicious of all of our native mints, for things like tea. And anise hyssop, if you're not familiar with that, it's, I mean, just delicious flavor, really unique leaf taste. You can also eat the flowers either fresh. All three of these, the entire plant is edible, either fresh or dried. So just a really easy plant to grow for your own use, and bees are using it all summer long as well. New Jersey tea is another one that's it's a tea plant. The leaves are a tea plant that tastes a lot like a green tea or a black tea, but it's not caffeinated. And I don't know that I would choose that as one of my top plants just because it's really slow growing and it has kind of a weird, you know, it's low and spreading. So it has a little bit of a awkward shape to work with in a garden. Goldenrod, of course, common in the wild and great to grow as well. If you were going to pick a goldenrod for your garden, I would probably choose the grass leaf goldenrod or showy goldenrod, one of those two probably, just for being more contained and not spreading like crazy. Stinging nettles are a native that are often overlooked, but there are butterflies that will only feed their larvae the leaves of stinging nettles. And then, of course, it's such a nutritional native plant for us. And then, yeah, some of these other shrubs as well. I'm sure I'm missing some awesome natives for your garden. Milkweed would be a great one for supporting monarchs, but also a myriad of other things. Yeah. Okay, I'll go back to, are there more questions? Otherwise, I'll go back to a couple of these slides.
I'm not seeing any questions. No, but.
Okay, then
Yeah.
I'll show you this bee. So this is one of the smallest bees that we have in Minnesota, and it's called a fairy bee. That's my hand, and that's the bee. So you can see how it's just tiny. And it will only, this is a mother female. You can always tell if a bee is a female if she's collecting pollen, because the males don't do that. So she's got pollen on her legs, and the pollen from this purple prairie clover is like very orange, and she's bringing that home to her larvae, and that's the only kind of pollen she'll feed them. So very, very specialized relationship. So this would be a bee that could never live on dandelions. You've got to have like the diverse native plants. And this is an example of a butterfly that will only feed, the larvae only feed on violets. And I think, you know, we're all probably pretty familiar with how monarchs will only feed on milkweed. But in the case of the monarchs, the mother monarch lays her egg directly on a milkweed plant, which is really nice for that larva to just hatch out of an egg and there's its food. This butterfly just flies over the prairie and drops her eggs. So the larvae have to hatch and find the right host plant and start feeding on it, which, I mean, to me, it speaks to the kind of just how our plant communities have changed. Like these violets must have once been common enough that the butterfly could get away with that. Now they're not, and this butterfly is really seriously struggling. It's, you know, you can see on this map here, really the only place it's doing okay is Kansas. Everywhere else, it's either completely gone, presumed to be gone, or critically imperiled or imperiled. So yeah, a lot of insects are struggling because of loss of their host plant. Here I'm just showing you, I know I just have a couple minutes left. These are the top plants in our region for supporting butterfly and moth diversity. And what's striking is that a lot of our native trees are really, really important for these different species. So this is a moth that feeds primarily on poplar. This one feeds primarily on maple and prunus and birch. And then this one feeds primarily on black ash. Beautiful animals. Okay, so a couple ways to get involved in just these last couple minutes. Bumble Bee Watch is one. This is a citizen science or community science project where we're encouraging people to just snap photos of any bumblebee you see and submit them on this Bumble Bee Watch interface, either on your phone or computer. And I mean, target species for us in this area are the rusty patch bumblebee, which was last seen in Duluth in 1913. I don't know of any records in Carleton County. There are about 8 records in Pine County from 1938. It's been seen up the shore well over 50 years ago and in the Bayfield area. So, I mean, it used to be here, but is not now. To our knowledge, but it would be really great to find it, just to be, you know, to protect those populations. And another not federally listed but should be bee right here that is hanging on in this area is the yellow banded bumblebee, and this one is distinctive in having, it's the only bee up here that has yellow right on the tail end, right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. So if you saw that, that'd be worth snapping a picture of it and letting us know. A lot of people this time of year, especially, I'm getting lots of emails from people thinking that they found the rusty patch bumblebee, but they're actually seeing this bee, which has a lot of orange on it, and it's one of our most common bees. But it differs from the rusty patch in just how much orange it has. The rusty patch has just a really faint little semicircle of orange. Okay, I also wanted to let you know about this plant kit sale. It sounds like some of you are already in the loop and have purchased kits. But if you need more information, contact Carleton Soil and Water. And then this project as well. So Carleton County Soil and Water and Xerces and the Oldenburg Arts Group have partnered to do some demonstration demonstration installations in Carleton County and with Fond du Lac, and we still have funding available for 15 projects. They can be in residential spaces or community spaces. Lots of different options, ranging from, you know, something that might look like this picture, a little pocket habitat, to something much more large, like up to 3-acre meadow. And Alyssa is on this Zoom meeting as well, so she might have more to chime in, but she's available with the county to provide technical assistance from start to finish. We're really excited to be promoting a lot of organic weed control methods, so not going in and using herbicides, but trying other approaches. And yeah, just reach out if you're interested in getting more involved or helping to design these plantings. I mean, we have the option too to do plantings that are primarily or strictly like culturally significant plants or edible, you know, there could be a focus on edibles. So yeah, lots of options. Lots of Xerces resources, and yeah, just thanks a lot again for having me, and I'm looking forward to a time when we can be in person and I can hear more from all of you, because this feels a little bit one-sided, but yeah, thanks.
Yeah, miigwech, Sarah. Really appreciate it. And it's cool to see the list of the plants that the bees like, because that's also a lot of the plants that, like, my grandma told me her grandma made teas out of and things like that, or a lot of the berries and things we like to eat. So that's, yeah, it's just cool.
Yeah.
It makes so much sense, of course, but I just haven't seen it laid out like that.
It does. I know there's so much overlap.
And then I think it was Sue wanted to see another slide. Was it the one, I think, with the rusty patch? What? Go for it.
Yeah, nope. Go forward one.
That way?
Nope.
That way?
No. Yes, right there. I take photos once in a while of different slides. Not that one, the last one.
This one.
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
And I put this in the chat, but I'll just add in. So Phil Savage from our 13 Moons program, he has been working with the Carleton County Soil and Water District and Oldenburg Art Center to kind of be our local contact too. So you guys can reach out through this, but you can also reach out through Phil if you feel more comfortable doing that or whatever, to get a kit.
Thanks.
Good idea. Yeah, thanks.
I'm curious, we participated in this last year, and I'm not sure if anybody on this call received a kit. If you did and you'd be willing to speak up on how things went, that might be nice. And if not, that's okay too.
I know there were some extra ones last year, and they're hanging out in front of the dome. And I do have some white sage too that's just been exploding if anyone needs some right away.
Yeah, I should ask too if Alyssa or is Phil on this call? If either of them have more to say.
I don't think I saw Phil, but yeah, Alyssa, go for it.
Yeah,
How about you?
Yeah, so I'm with miigwech. This was really great. I love this presentation, and Sarah, it's always so fun hearing you talk. You're just so passionate. So yeah, I just wanted to introduce myself, and I think Sarah covered our program pretty well, but we've been pretty fortunate to get a bunch of funding to do pollinator plantings. It's kind of a pilot project, and we actually have 15 plantings slotted for Fond du Lac, and we can pay up to 100% of your project. So we want to help you. And I think in the chat box, I put a link to where to contact myself. And then also you have Sarah's information. And otherwise, I know that I've been talking to Phil, and I think you put something in your newsletter recently. But anyways, just thanks for the great presentation. Wanted to introduce myself, and yeah, go pollinators.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Sarah. Thanks so much, Alyssa and Miigwech. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here tonight. We're yeah, just about right at 6:30. So yeah, I'll stop the recording. If anyone wants to ask more questions off the record, you sure can. So miigwech.